Hello and welcome to another episode of Words and Wine. It's been a while, I've missed you guys. So tonight I'm finally talking about Brené Brown's Braving the Wilderness. Amazing book. I only talk about books that I love, obviously. One of the things that has really stuck with me is this idea of people getting to the end of their lives and really regretting the fact that they didn't live the life true to themselves. So I wish I would have lived a life more true to myself rather than the life that I thought other people wanted me to lead. I think we can mistake that as being selfish, but it's not selfish. We do our best work when we're able to be who we truly are, when we're able to, unshackle ourselves from that armor and kind of get out there and actually have the courage to face society and face ourselves and our own battles as well. And this is something that sort of Braving the Wilderness really focuses on throughout the book. So what Brené Brown's talking about is this idea of true belonging. So she says true belonging doesn't require us to change who we are. It requires us to be who we are. Oh, Mia, do you want to say hello too? This is my cat, Mia. She often pops up while I'm filming. So she also touches on this idea of high lonesomes. There are a range of things that increase our chances of dying young. So obesity increases our chance of dying young by 20%. Alcoholism increases it by 30%. Loneliness increases it by 45%. Loneliness is something that has a range of impacts in our life. And, we kind of also associate it with attributing it to the actual person who's lonely and blaming them for being lonely. So this idea of being a loner, of not fitting in, of not being good enough for society is a real issue, and there's a lot of stigma that goes along with it. Right? Loneliness is something that keeps us afraid of connecting with others, of reaching out. And so what she's saying is that this is sort of like a spiritual crisis. So there's a section of the book that I wanted to read to you. It's on page 45, and it's in her chapter called High Lonesome, A Spiritual Crisis. Now, I'm an atheist, but I think that spirituality is something that, you don't necessarily need to be religious to appreciate. And she says that spirituality is recognizing and celebrating that we are all inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than all of us, and that our connection to that power and to one another is grounded in love and compassion. And then she goes on in this other part of the book to talk about the fact that people are hard to hate close up, and that we need to move in and actually really try to get to know people who might not have the same ideas as us. So in our society, what's happening a lot of the time is that we're sort of seeing people as either you're with us or against us. And she talks about that false dichotomy of you're either with us or you're against us. You can't be somewhere in the middle. But actually this idea of true belonging often brings up the fact that we have really complicated, complex ways of thinking about things, and our ideas aren't so simple as for or against. So the example that she uses in the book is that she, her ideas around gun laws. So she says that, I am not pro-guns in the sense of I don't think everyone should just be able to own a semi-automatic weapon, but I also grew up, hunting, and that was something that my family did, and we were taught how to use guns in a responsible way in order to hunt. And so it's not a black and white issue for her. I think this, one of the really important sort of ideas she talks about is this dehumanizing of other people. And it's actually something that Roman Krasnarek explains in his book Empathy as well, where he talks about, as soon as we start dehumanizing people, then we are really at risk of kind of justifying really bad behaviors. It's how we justify treating people as less than human. And, she uses the example of, Trump, and saying, like, when people say, oh, Trump's a pig, well, actually, if you're doing that, you're kind of just as bad as Trump, because he will call people that. That doesn't mean you need to lower yourself to his standards. And it's not helpful. It's not helpful at the end of the day to be sort of behaving in a way that we actually don't like ourselves, which is why people have issues with Trump in the first place. So moving in and actually getting to learn what people really think and understanding their perspectives, it's very hard to hate them. It's very hard to dehumanize them when that happens. And I think that's a really important concept that we need to think about, is that we need to really look at everyone and the common things that we share. And, that kind of, I guess, incorporates that aspect of spirituality in there as well. The other part of the book I really wanted to read to you is towards the end. It's in her final chapter on strong back, soft front, wild heart. And so she talks about strong back in that sense of, you have to have boundaries. You have to have reliability and accountability. So when she says reliability, she's talking about learning how to say what we mean and mean what we say. And boundaries is obviously that, we need to not have that fear of disappointing people, so that we can keep ourselves at enough of a distance to recognize that just because someone doesn't agree with us or doesn't like us doesn't mean that we're in the wrong or we need to feel bad about that. Accountability, so learning how to step up. The other thing she talks about is having a vault, so being able to keep confidence. Integrity, so learning how to practice our values even when it's uncomfortable and hard. Non-judgment, so learning how to give and receive help. And she talks about, which is a concept that she talks about in her other book, Rising Strong, which I've mentioned before, is this idea of letting go of the helper and fixer role, which is something that I guess, is sort of in that drama triangle as well. So, you have the rescuer and you have the victim and you have the victimizer. And by, sort of being judgmental, we can fall into the drama triangle quite easily. And then generosity as well. So she says learning how to set the boundaries that allow us to be generous in our assumptions about others. So the challenge is being honest and clear with others about what's okay and what's not okay, which I think falls into, as she's saying, falls into boundaries as well. But then she also talks about having a soft front, and this goes back to the work that she's done on vulnerability. So this idea that it's important that we're able to remain vulnerable, because when we start putting walls up, we're not really being ourselves anymore. And I think that's one of the challenges with belonging, is that if we're too afraid to be ourselves, we're too afraid to be vulnerable, then we're not really living our lives. And I think that's the thing for me that it always comes back to, is that how can I live my life in a way that is really true to myself? And if I belong to myself, at least I belong to myself, because before I can belong anywhere, I have to belong in myself. For soft front, she says, many of us armor up early as a way to protect ourselves as children. Once we grow into adults, we start to realize that the armor is preventing us from growing into our gifts and ourself. Just like we can strengthen our courage muscle for a stronger back by examining our need to be perfect and please others at the expense of our own life, we can exercise the vulnerability muscle that allows us to soften and stay open rather than attack and defend. This means getting comfortable with vulnerability. Most of the time we approach life with an armored front for two reasons. One, we're not comfortable with emotions and we equate vulnerability with weakness. Or two, our experiences of trauma have taught us that vulnerability is actually dangerous. Violence and oppression have made our soft front a liability, and we struggle to find a place emotionally and physically safe enough to be vulnerable. The definition of vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. But vulnerability is not a weakness. It's our most accurate measure of courage. When the barrier is our belief about vulnerability, the question becomes, are we willing to show up and be seen when we can't control the outcome? As someone who is a control freak, that's very, very scary. But I think, it's something that takes a long time, and this is definitely something that I'm trying to do in my life, is try to practice being vulnerable as much as I can. Because when I do that, I reap the rewards of that as well. I feel like I'm really living my life and that I have a sense of purpose and a sense of identity. I'm not just being fake. And that feeling of being fake, I think, is linked with loneliness as well. Because when you feel, have you ever had that feeling, when you're at a party and you're trying to kind of fit in with everyone and be cool, and you can be surrounded by hundreds of people, but you actually feel really alone. And that's something I've definitely felt in the past, where I've tried to fit in and I've just ended up feeling very alone, no matter how many people I talk to. You know, and it's almost like I'm sort of bullshitting, you know, I'm kind of bullshitting my life. And she actually talks about the concept of bullshitting here as well, where, you know, people kind of say, oh, I know about this, but I actually have no idea about something. And being brave enough to say, you know what, I actually don't know a lot about this, and being willing to also ask for someone else's perception. And maybe they don't have the same perception as you, but at least we've learned something, you know, we've been curious. Wild heart is the other one. So she says, the mark of a wild heart is living out the paradox of love in our lives. It's the ability to be tough and tender, excited and scared, brave and afraid, all in the same amount. It's showing up in our vulnerability and our courage, being both fierce and kind. A wild heart can also straddle the tension of staying awake to the struggle of the world and fighting for justice and peace, while also cultivating its own moments of joy. I know a lot of people, myself included, who feel guilt and even shame about their own moments of joy. How can I play on this gorgeous beach with my family while there are people who have no home or safety? Why am I working so hard to decorate my son's birthday cupcakes like cute little Despicable Me minions when there are so many Syrian children starving to death? What difference do these stupid cupcakes really make? They matter because joy matters. And I love that so much, because I think it's something that we can so easily get caught up in when we're aware of what is happening in the world, that we think, oh, there's so many people that are worse off than me. Why do I get to enjoy my life? And that is a bit of a paradox with this idea that we're all connected as well, because it's sort of like we, you know, she talks about this as well. We suffer when other people suffer. When we see things on the news and we hear about horrible things happening, we feel that. But at the same time, being able to sort of have joy in our lives is such an important thing, you know. And I think it's rejuvenating. It enables us to do more and have a greater impact in other people's lives as well, if we can stay strong and sort of look after ourselves and nourish ourselves in a way that is important for our own lives. So this sort of paradox of like individual life and the greater good and society, it's a tricky thing to kind of deal with. And I think that Brené Brown outlines some really key things about being able to hold both of these things for ourselves and protect both of these things. And one of the things she actually said is more dangerous is to deny that suffering is happening in order to feel okay about celebrating joy. So kind of turning a blind eye is not what we want to do. We want to be able to acknowledge the fact that there are things, little things that we could do that could really make a difference, and appreciate the fact, be grateful for the fact that, you know, we have these moments of joy. You know, so being able to do both of those things at the same time is hard, but it brings more meaning to our lives. So it's quite depressing to think, oh, I can never celebrate anything because, you know, other people are having a hard time. Actually, everyone has their own battles to deal with. And I love this bit as well. And sorry, I'm reading a lot of sections of the book, but I had so many, like, I don't know if you can see, but I had so many like tags on the pages, the things that I liked about this. But she says, if we go back to the definition of true belonging, we can see that it's built on a foundation of tensions and paradoxes. True belonging is the spiritual practice of believing in and belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share your most authentic self with the world and find sacredness in both being a part of something and standing alone in the wilderness. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. So, I mean, this book, it's not a very hard read. It's only, I don't think it's even it's 163 pages. So it's quite a quick read, but there's a lot in there. And I think I'll probably come back to this book a few times because there's a lot to digest. I think it's actually probably her best book that she's written. This is her fourth one. And I think, you know, what I really liked about it is this idea of standing up and being active in society, but also being able to come back to yourself and spend time with yourself and enjoy your life. I think that it's something that really does speak to what I started off saying in the beginning, this idea of people getting to the end of their life and thinking, I really wish I would have lived my life differently. I wish I would have really truly belonged. You know, I really wish that I would have belonged to myself and I would have thought more about myself. So, yeah, fantastic book. Highly recommend reading it, Braving the Wilderness by Brené Brown. If you have any thoughts or questions, please leave it below in the comment section. I'd love to hear from you. And yeah, I haven't really thought about what I'm going to do next for next week. So if you have any ideas of something you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. And I'll see you next week for more Words and Wine. Have a good night, guys.